Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to accept your invitation to be here for this opportunity for debate. We have a very challenging theme to address involving public-private relationships in Brazil in health through compliance. So the idea of questioning whether we are revolutionizing these relationships or not. And I am very glad to be in a company of very successful and highly qualified people. So first, we have our dear José Francisco Compagno with a long career. He's been partner of successful auditing firms, and today he's an independent consultant. And we had a very nice conversation, and he's telling us that he is in the famous city of Preá, right next to the not least famous Jericoacoara in the state of Ceará in Brazil. And we have Patricia Frossard, is the national manager of Philips and also a legal consultant of Philips for Latin America. And Sérgio Fausto, with a long career, although he's very young, and he is the CEO of Foundation President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So we organized ourselves to, first of all, hear José Francisco and successively other guest speakers. And so each one will have 10 minutes for the opening remarks. So José Francisco, please tell me your vision, the vision of Ceará, and your vision on public-private relationships, compliance, and health. So link all the dots. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all my fellow panelists and everyone watching us. I would like to thank the invitation of FIS Week for the invitation and for the initiative to organize this event. I'm going to give you an overview in order to encourage the chat and the conversation here. But just to set the context for later discussion, I would like to reinforce the event and a conference trying to have a more in-depth discussion about topics related to health could not be any more timely because everything that is going on because of the pandemic. Likewise, it's very opportune to discuss issues related to compliance and its derivations or consequences in society, and its impact and consequences in the health care industry. I think it's very timely for us to have this discussion regarding compliance. Compliance has really boomed in Brazil from 2004 to 2018. Well, there was a combination of events, and Patricia is more on the day-to-day of compliance. So there was the boom of compliance, maybe due to two factors or two drivers, two events. First was the approval of the law, the Anti-Corruption Act, the Clean Record, as we call it here in Brazil. So it is a law that was regulating punishment for companies that were involved in actions against the government in terms of active corruption, with a legislation that can be criticized, but it followed the standards of other global existing laws. And at the same time, we also had the car wash operation, which, in my opinion, and due to political issues and legal issues, it may have had its flaws, but technically, in terms of integrity and compliance, the car wash operation was an operation that really fostered law enforcement activity, very intense in Brazil, with a very short time. If we compare the effective of the Anti-Corrupt Act in the US or the Anti-Corruption Act in the US, but in addition to Brazil, it was approved in late 2013. In 2014, we had a car wash operation, and then there was a whole movement which somehow served as an incentive for companies to invest in their internal structures of compliance, integrity, and other issues related and other things that encouraged or fostered activities related to compliance. So we had a period when there was a regulation landmark established in 2013-14 and law enforcement activity. And in terms of compliance activities, it's worked in a very explosive way, so to speak. It led to a boom in compliance activities. It's not because of luck, but it's because of pain, but companies had to structure themselves in a very short time span. And along this period, a few structures or public structures of corruption fighting form the pillars of the law enforcement activity, as I have just mentioned. As of the beginning of 2019, the scenario changed. To put it in a nutshell, so in a context where the structures that were created and developed, they rapidly provided quite significant results in the corporate world, they were dismantled, so to speak. The law enforcement activity then suffered a process of dismantling, which is quite significant. And today, practically, at least with regards to law enforcement activities, there are no more law enforcement activities. And I think here's the challenge of the corporate world in terms of compliance, because just as the manufacturers have contributed for the industry, so to speak, for compliance practices to strengthen, a lack of a more efficient law enforcement activity may serve as a lack of incentive for companies to structure themselves against possible risks related to compliance. So talking about the corporate world and overall vision, these are the things for us to deal with over the past few years. In the healthcare industry, which was also impacted by this movement of car wash and other operations, it's a heavily regulated industry. And obviously, because of this regulation, it needs to have a very robust compliance structure, and this was not the case in Brazil. After what I have mentioned, this became slightly more significant for Brazilian companies. However, international companies are those that structure themselves in terms of building compliance practices because they already adopted the international ones, especially those that were only Brazilian were well structured, and then after that, the Brazilian companies structure themselves and they follow the international ones because of competitiveness and risk. And so they were also joined the compliance world in the healthcare industry.
Well, I believe that one of the main challenges that we have ahead of us, especially for healthcare companies, and we are speaking of a wide range of companies with very specific characteristics, such as healthcare plans, hospitals, those that produce medical devices. One of them has, they have different risk levels, but all healthcare companies has a very marked and close relationship with the public sector in different ways. Of course, we cannot consider them all to be the same because it's a widely diverse sector. But one of the challenges we all face, which is part of all productive activities, but healthcare is more susceptible, and at the same time, it has a number of risks which are innate to the industry. So the challenges we are going to face from now on, especially concerning healthcare, are integration. We are going to discuss here compliance, but it's also a widely diversified activity. And compliance goes beyond not only anti-corruption, it involves a number of issues of what the market calls corporate integrity and the concepts of ESG. The healthcare industry is subject to specific risks and to adaptations in our current context. So these were my initial remarks. I hope in our discussion we can approach all the different topics and contribute to the discussion that industry players will have to have. Thank you, José Francisco. We are going to have the pleasure to listen to Patricia, which will speak from her position in a top company. Is it a process that has really gained importance in the industry? And how do you see this delicate correlation between public and private? Pleasure to have you here. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm an exception when we speak about a lawyer leading a business. So this panel speaks very close to my technical experience as a lawyer and also in my position today. When I took over the head of legal and compliance for Latin America, some people really asked me, isn't there a conflict of interest in your position? And I really asked myself, well, if there is a position in the company that has a conflict with compliance, this is such a job that should not exist. When we are speaking about compliance, we have to talk about people, not public and private sector. And I like to introduce like that because we believe that organizations are formed by people, and people go from private to public and public back to private. So compliance within this equation, it means that we are all human beings, we are all people, and we have our own levels of ethics, compliance, which might be different for different people. I don't like to think about compliance for public or private sector, no, because there are some sensitive issues among private relationships as well. And I always like to bring about examples of behaviors. And whenever I talk about compliance, I bring that to the discussion. So Facebook, social network, and once I saw a comment of someone saying, do you know anyone who could help us just deal with our driving license and our penalties? And I read the comments. Some people just say, well, it's wrong. It's illegal. You cannot do it. Others recommend someone who do it. Or the WhatsApp group of our condos. Well, I have here a list of wines being sold by a friend, much cheaper than if we buy in the store. So have they paid for tax? And some people tend not to ask themselves whether this is right or wrong. As has been pointed out by José Francisco, Lava Jato and the anti-corruption law are very important landmarks in our country. I really think that we have changed levels of understanding concerning corruption and compliance. It started in 2013, and since then, everyone has been talking about that. So it really puts people into thinking about that before making decisions, before taking actions. There is, everyone is the same. We really have to understand that there are people, people change, and we have to take our concepts wherever we go. Once we start to see that, I'm sure we'll be able to have a more reasonable thinking. I see people who say, well, this is wrong, it should be like that. But there was a period during a period of blindness, so to speak, ethical blindness. And I'm talking about people, population, everything. And I can see less and less tolerance concerning that, people really wanting to do the right thing. Well, after this general information, Philips is a leader in healthcare and technology, and of course, it has to interact with the government. It wouldn't be fair with our SUS patients. So why aren't I going to sell to the government if I know that why am I not going to do business with that where 50% of the hospitals lies? There are 3,500 private hospitals and 3,000 public hospitals in Brazil. So if I don't sell to them, the population won't have access to whatever I have to sell. And we have relationships with the government. Philips has been in the market for 130 years. And we've been in Brazil for many years, somewhat fewer than 130, and we've been very successful in our relationships. Our compliance policies are robust enough to avoid compliance problems, and if they happen, because we are speaking about people, we have to take quick measures. And this is why a good compliance manual should have measures in case of violation. If there is anything wrong, you detect that and you end up paying the price. I strongly believe in this relationship with public and private sector. We have a public-private partnership which is very active. The first one in healthcare, I believe, is the only one for health diagnostics with the government of Bahia. It started in 2015. We, from the private sector, invested $40 million to create 11 diagnostic centers in 11 different hospitals, and we created one single report preparation. So we've increased 44% the capacity of running or doing these tests. And the public contract is just similar to the private contract, where we've created KPIs to really confirm whether we have provided what was combined. We have an independent audit that inspects the contract. It should be a widely known consulting company. It's Ernst Young, and we just replace the consulting company every 3 years because that's market practice. And they run independent audits to make sure that the KPIs are being met. It is possible to have relationships with the government and provide the best in terms of technology so that the final beneficiary will be the patient, regardless of going to a private or a public hospital. And at the same time, we can show a cost reduction as well. We have proactively worked with different healthcare agencies to submit projects such as this. This is part of the partnership law. If the government is willing to receive private partners, so a RFI is open to the market for free, like a bidding process. And once it's done, if the government decides which project will be implemented, a public consultation or a process of public bidding is opened. So it's possible to innovate with the public sector, especially teaching centers. They are very active in terms of telemedicine, teleconsultation, distance services, and I can see a lot of opportunities for patients, for industry, and for the government. So these would be my initial highlights. Thank you, Patricia. So hearing Patricia and José Francisco, I am under the impression that I can see that the anti-corruption law has been an important landmark, but we have been experiencing some movement backwards. But Patricia indicated that now people are much more aware, the population is aware, and the private companies are committed. So is it half full, half empty? How do you see our current situation? What do you Sérgio, such a close observer, would recommend that we interpret that? Well, I think the glass is getting filled up. I am the only one who's not a specialist in the topic, but I'm going to try to give you a broader perspective here.
And within this broader perspective, that despite any possible setbacks in a more recent period, there is a clear trend, not just in this industry, but in many other industries of the Brazilian economy, to adjust themselves in order to comply with international standards. This is important. Brazil is a signatory of at least 3 anti-corruption conventions that are very important. The United Nations, the OECD, and the American states. And Brazil is a signatory of that regime. Now, Brazil is trying to get a seat in the OECD. One of the obstacles for Brazil to join OECD is non-compliance in the area of corruption. So a monitoring group was created for Brazil because of the recent setbacks. So there is a set of international pressures of multilateral organizations because Brazil is not an island or an outcast in international scenario, but there are some attempts in making Brazil an outcast, but Brazil will not be an outcast. So this obliges the private industry to play this game, wants to play the game of compliance from the understanding, as José Francisco mentioned, extended, incorporating certain responsibilities towards a society. And this applies for the set of companies and more specifically for one industry, which is the healthcare industry, that provides essential services and goods for the population. It's not just by chance that it is a heavily regulated industry. Just from my memory, except for the financial industry, I don't think there is any other industry in the Brazilian economy where the private initiative is so heavily regulated. This is related because this industry offers essential services and goods. So this industry is likely to grow because of very specific things. Number one, Brazil has been going through a process of demographic and transition that is very, very fast. Brazil is aging very fast, and this will change the profile of demand for healthcare. So epidemiologically speaking, we still have demands that are typical of an underdeveloped country because the number of young people and children is going down in terms of share of the total population, and the country has advanced. And because we are increasing the share of a population that is elderly, Brazil is an important market in terms of equipment and consumption of goods and services in healthcare. But there is some weight in the distribution because of the set of major companies operating in this industry. So this is an industry that will grow. It's a heavily regulated industry, and regulation has been undergoing transformation. So it's important that this is internalized by companies, and it is being internalized by companies. And then we will need to separate apples from oranges. So for many different reasons, some companies will go on playing the game, that is to depend from special relationships with the state through the political system. We have the COVID investigation commission, and other companies are already playing a different game, not just because they are vested, because they're saints. They are in the market of services and goods and the capitals market. And if they don't do that, they will be out. And the reputational risk that they run today is a very significant reputational risk, and they are aware of that. And they are trying to be structured and to be ready for that. So I see that in spite of any setbacks, the future is better than the present. The glass is filling up. So this is good for Brazil, good for this industry, and it is important that the political world should change too, and that companies should be very specific in terms of creating boundaries that cannot be crossed. Because either you do that or we are going to sink. It will be a wreck. So the prospect of making Brazil into a pariah or an outcast international system, no prestige, will not be sitting on a table with the most powerful nations. Well, this is a possibility, but I think that the strength of the private enterprise, the strength here represented by Patricia, will make us go into a different direction. And I think we can be optimistic. Now we're back live. I cannot see Britto anymore. No, no. I heard everything that you said. Britto. Here he is. He's back. I apologize. Something happened. Thank you very much. All your comments were very interesting. But the second part of this event and now we want to have interventions. And I would like to start asking you a few questions that are leading characters playing a game in the public sector. And there is an ethical sense of everyone playing this public game. And there are some pressures of the civil society, organisms, and control towards the public sector. And some of them will lead to a better result or a worse result. Would you accept my provocation of getting these three players and tell me who's going to do better or worse in the public sector? Legislation controls will be better. Are they better or worse than the pressure on society and control organs in terms of their assessing each one of these? So your provocation has been very interesting, Britto. And I might be the least optimistic in the group. I agree with everyone that the fight against corruption is not a sprint, but rather a marathon. And we are having a test of tiredness. And actually, this is a snapshot. And this is very negative. This is the law. And if I may say, so we have just recently approved the law, the act that has just passed in the Congress, and there is a clear indication of the political world for corporate defense of actions of mismanagement. So the thing that really caught our attention in this act is the clause saying that for anyone to accuse a public agent, we need to prove their intention of malice. This is impossible. So just drawing a parallel, the Anti-Corruption Act talked about objective responsibility. And this might be the most strict issue, legally speaking. If we generate a consequence in the law, it doesn't matter whether you had the intention or not, but you have an objective responsibility. And it defines that you need to prove the intention of the manager. So here there is a movement in the opposite direction. So in terms of legislation, and we could also say and then there is also a setback. Now, talking about control organs, we might get to a situation but everything is at a standstill in relation to fighting corruption and in terms of law enforcement. You see the prosecutor's office, that nothing goes forward, they have no interest, and this is the biggest symbol of setback of control activities. So this control activity is not prepared for an action in terms of political action, and we are dealing with, I wouldn't like to put the car wash operation on a pedestal, but they provided very clear benefits for the anti-corruption practices. But it's not just the car wash, but the structure that made car wash possible. And for it to start in a prosecutor's office, it's under severe attack that has already generated concrete results. So when we look at the two main control agencies, federally speaking, so we have the Attorney General that are loosening the actions of making public managers responsible. I think that the individual behavior or attitude, individual behavior depends a little bit on these two other items. I think that the population was very much influenced by the car wash operation that we discussed, compliance, that no one knew what it is. You got in a taxi, the taxi driver, in a restaurant, everywhere. So because of the car wash operation, the ethics issues became very popular. And I think that today we still have a certain legacy of that work, but I am very skeptical and very concerned when there is a loosening of other mechanisms that make it possible to improve the ethical attitude of the population, whether this ethical attitude doesn't run the risk of having a setback. So I think that we are under a challenge. So everything that was that people won in a very hard way is now under attack, and it is significantly weakened. Now, as a society, we need to see, and then corporations are part of society, we need to see if society, in terms of corporate organizations and people individually, if they can evolve alone in terms of improving ethics, the national ethics, without the public activities by the legislator and control agencies. I'm skeptical, and now I am just watching how this is going to evolve and how we're going to build this over the next 4 or 5 years. So, and from 14 to 18, there is a process more intense of dismantling. There are some studies relating optimism to the weather. When I see that José Francisco is pessimistic in the very sunny coast of Ceará, and I can see someone optimistic in the gloomy São Paulo, well, it's kind of gloomy here in São Paulo if I were to depend on that, but I'm also very optimistic. Every year we have a survey with 3,000 health managers globally. And here we're talking about people in Europe, Brazil, Latin America, China, North America. And we measure a few things, including something that is very optimistic, something that has been demonstrated in the research in the people in healthcare, in spite of everything that the healthcare industry dealt with globally, they're all very optimistic. If they are optimistic after managing hospitals during the pandemic of the COVID, and thank God now things are much better, why wouldn't I be optimistic? I think that in terms of legislation, we already have many acts. I don't think we need more laws. The Anti-Corrupt Act has been a milestone or a landmark, but it already existed in the penal code with active and passive corruption. And I also think, and I agree, that there are expectations of creating laws that we as a society should pay attention, so that what we have already accomplished or one will not be lost. So we want it to continue and for the glass to be fuller and fuller so that we don't go back. In our industry, in my case, the private industry, we should not be limited by fear. Our policies need to be very clear. Our limits need to be very clear. We need to train our sales forces very intensely so that our limits are not, so it's not about just not offering what is good and best for the public industry. We should not be limited by fear. I think that fear sometimes is the fear of the unknown, of how to work and how to react in situations that are not so compliant as we see. Sérgio, how do you see today the public aspect of this equation? And what could you tell us? And could you tell us how is sunshine like close to where you live? Well, it's cloudy, it's outcast. Maybe his glass is fuller after what we said. It's not so full because I have already drank it. But the picture, the photography, so we can say with some degree of certainty So, but there are strengths, objective strengths, pushing towards greater transparency, greater integrity, greater compliance in the relationships in a private enterprise as a whole, and more specifically in the healthcare industry. What I find important are two things. Number one, of course, this issue is not something that is limited only to the theme of corruption. And so there are many different resources and an agreement between civil servants and private companies and the government. So the regulation in health is much broader than this, and it's clearer than ever now in the pandemic with vaccines, patents. And the issue that is put, which is the theme that is universal or integral as understood by the Constitution, increasingly more expensive medications, the legal or the judiciary system is under greater and greater pressure. So there is the fact that there will be more and more treatments for diseases that today are regarded as incurable. The society is going to make pressure for that, and companies will need to deal with that. This is an important theme. This is an area of friction between the public initiative and society. So it needs to be very clear the scope of these issues that we could somehow capitulate within the theme of integrity, compliance, ESG, and other things of similar nature. So there are companies playing the old game, and they find some receptiveness in the legislative and executive branches. But I have to believe that Brazil is moving towards a different direction. If Brazil had no weight in the world, if Brazil were a banana republic on the corner and elites could do whatever they wanted without suffering consequences, I would be more pessimistic. But Brazil is a country that is integrated in the world, with a society that is more and more integrated. It has a prosecutor's office that is increasingly more integrated. So we have companies, integrations, and people, and the press too, that make us believe that the glass is filling up. No, dear friend, if you are pessimistic, go to a gloomy place and then you're going to become more pessimistic. This is what the conclusion we can take from here, empirical conclusions. So now this thing of compliance has grown so much that there is even compliance with a clock. And so we need to keep on looking at the clock all the time. Now going for a last round with the three friends, I would like to add something here. If there was no legislation in the healthcare industry telling what is legal and what is not legal, if there was no regulation on what can and must be done, there's a very simple way in compliance with health plans. Ask if what is going to be done meets the interests of patients. The healthcare industry has a limit to cling to. If there was no rule or regulation, is it good enough or not? For the final round, how do you see in a specific case of healthcare this need to, in addition to looking at inflation and everything, to also put the patient at the center in terms of the decisions that are made by the healthcare industry. So Patricia, you go first. So Patricia, you go first. I would say that then you get to a point that companies need to work more and more on, which is their mission. What is your purpose? And I think that once again, it's getting clearer and clearer that there is no work without purpose. People ask themselves, why am I working for this company? Does this company pollute? Do they sell products that will affect the health of people? So I think that the more people ask themselves this question, because they consume that product. And I think that transparency is increasingly more required, and there is not much space for those who are not compliant with these rules and within these limits. So we have this mission, incorporate the mission, which is to improve the lives of people. And I cannot do that. I can simply sell a product that is not good quality. I need to provide conditions for my employees to work in my company and also to be in good health. It's not just my what I do, but it's how I operate in society. And there's no way back. And as we work with people, and this has grown a lot in the pandemic, people were wondering, why should I go to the office? Why can't I work from home? My mental health matters more. And same thing for compliance. What you sell, does it have quality or not? I think that we as companies have this mission. And I think this is what is going to tell us which companies will remain in the future. Now, brief final comments by José Francisco and last Sérgio. So very briefly, I agree with Patricia. And as I said in the beginning, there's the issue of integrating compliance practices that are traditional and other issues in the business as we call corporate integrity. And this agrees very much with what Patricia said. Today, it's not enough not to do it. Companies need to think for themselves where they are positioned, but it's fundamental for healthcare companies, and especially with all the learning, because in reality, COVID has been a disgrace, a global tragedy, but especially the healthcare industry needs to come out with it, with lessons learned for their strategy. So today, for the concept of compliance and integrity, it should be extended to core in the healthcare industry in terms of research and development, operation, communication, and also internal issues, as Patricia mentioned. It makes no sense for a company to have the ESG discourse and to treat their employees as if the only objective is to make money. So I think that the healthcare industry is spearheading, should take this. And this is the final end of your business, your customer, which deep down and in the end is the patient using your products, and they want to remain alive. And the pandemic has brought many practical lessons to us of how to do it and how not to do it. Dear Sergio, so your final remarks? Well, my final remark is wearing the shoes of someone who was in the government for a long time. So I am a little bit biased. So using the patient as a ruler, it solves part of things, but not the whole problem. Let me give you a specific example. Very expensive drugs. Should the government pay for importing drugs that do not exist in Brazil, and those having the benefit are people who have access to good lawyers, to the legal system, and that those funds that are used for these drugs are super sophisticated and they are needed for the other end of health management. And so is the government with technical capacity. So the Anvisa and ANS should be protected from political interests, and the prosecutor's office should not be part of this competition for positions, and companies should also say no loud and clear, no. Otherwise, there will be a disaster, as we had in the management of the pandemic by a Ministry of Health that was completely emptied from technical capacity. This is the preservation of people's lives. So the health of people is the supreme law. So if you want some, of course, in the government, you're going to give out and hand out, distribute positions, but in healthcare, no, we cannot allow that. So we have ended in high style with a few Latin words by our friend. So I would like to thank very much Patricia with her very intelligent remarks. In addition to her acknowledged professional capacity, and José Francisco, we apologize for taking him out from the beach, and also for his very firm assessment, and our Sérgio Fausto with his academic touch that we in healthcare can relate to it, and also the whole country. Thank you very much, Patricia, José Francisco, and Sérgio. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.